Hey, Karim Sirajuddin here, founder of Nude Human Consulting. The Coffee with Karim podcast aims to provide Muslims and people of all backgrounds a space to share their life gifts, meet dynamic guests, and enhance the human experience one cup of coffee at a time. Sit back and sip. Welcome to another episode of Coffee with Karim. Today I have an esteemed guest, Ustadh Joe Bradford. He is an American scholar of Islam, an instructor, and ethical investment advisor. He regularly lectures on topics such as Islamic Finance, Shariah Law, legal theory, and financial ethics. Don't forget to check out joebradford.net for more information on his work and projects. Brother Joe, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Wa alaikum salam. I appreciate you inviting me on.
All right. So I heard you actually on the Mad Mamluks myself. Shout out to the brothers there. I love you guys. And it was
You had a great episode, by the way.
Pardon?
Your episode on there was great. I think one of the best episodes that I've heard on there.
Akramakumullah. Which one are you referring to? The Dead Bedrooms one, or?
No, the one after that. I didn't hear the Dead Bedrooms one.
Even I forgot what was the other one on, but thank you. Mashallah. But yeah, I mean, I heard you there, and I reached out to you after that. So we've been kind of back and forth getting in touch, and finally, alhamdulillah, we were able to meet. So I'm very blessed on this Friday to get to conversate with you. And what I found really profound about your perspectives on the show was, I was like, awesome, an American Islamic scholar, and I know we have, alhamdulillah, a handful of those in the United States, obviously, but I definitely appreciated your points of view, so I'm very excited to pick your brain today. And what I kind of wanted to start it off with today was, as American Muslims, and I'm assuming you're a convert, is that correct, sir?
That's correct, yes.
Yeah, so I mean, my wife is a convert. I've done counseling for a lot of converts, and there always seems to be a tension between this idea of, well, what is the true Islam? And I always ask people, if Islam's the truth, then what is the true Islam? Because there's a lot of ideas and cultural expressions of Islam out there, and it can be really confusing. So I guess the first question I want to ask you is there such a thing as pure Islam? Because obviously any revelation that comes from the divine, there's going to be a socio-cultural pretext of which this revelation comes into. Like the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was an Arabian man, and so naturally you're going to have an Arabian, seasoning, if you will, to the Islamic tradition. So I wanted to first get your thoughts on that. Is there such thing as pure Islam? Why or why not? And how would we even start unpacking that in your opinion?
So, very relevant question, and I think it has a lot to do with the way that people form their ideas and mold their personal practice of their faith to what's in their mind. And, is there a pure Islam? I think that assumes a few things. And most of those things which are assumed are kind of in the mind of the person who's answering that question when we talk about people in the community. So what does it mean to be pure? What is Islam? Well, Islam is submission to God Almighty and through the obedience and following of his Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And so, what is it that God and his messenger want from us in any particular instance is essentially what the rule of Islam is. That's the general precept of Islam, and all of that going back, obviously, to worshiping God alone and the tawheed of God, the unicity or the oneness of God is the fundamental basis of everything in Islam. So, your question reminds me of the second verse in Surah Az-Zumar that says, Inna anzalna ilayk, well, the first verse is, Inna anzalna ilayka al-kitaba bil-haqqi fa'budillaha mukhlisan lahu ad-din. First verse says, indeed, we have revealed to you the book in truth, so worship God being pure to him in faith. Some might translate it as sincere to him in religion, but I prefer the word mukhlas to be translated as purity and deen to be translated as faith, because religion sometimes takes on dogmatic tones. Then it says, "Ala lillahi dinul khalis," is pure faith not for God? Rhetorical question, right? So I think before, when we're talking about pure Islam, many times it's used as a tool in the community to kind of pressure people into what our personal preconceived notions of what Islam should be. And that can sometimes take on a form which is antagonistic. It can take on a form which is political. It can take on a form which is cultural. It can take a form which is contrarian. And all of those play out because what we're doing is projecting our personal dispositions and presumptions onto the faith. So, I had a teacher and a mentor when I was living overseas studying, and he was from the middle of Saudi Arabia, which is known to be, very, very harsh environment, and very austere. And, he said to me, he said, what our problem here is? We take our harsh culture that grew out of the desert, wrap it in a cloak of Islam, and then present it to the world as if it's Islam. And we need you not to do that. So when we talk about what is pure Islam, I think we really have to understand that not fulfilling a personal cultural mandate, or should I say personal cultural mandate is not something which is part and parcel of Islam. It may coincide with the faith. It may be supported by the faith. It may be amended by the faith. It may be negated by the faith. But the faith is supreme. This idea of iman, this idea of deen, this idea of ummah, of being a community, is greater than any other concept, without being antagonistic or destructive to it. One of the challenges, however, is now that because so many Muslim cultures and ethnicities and nationalities and backgrounds see their personal cultures, nationalities, backgrounds, whatever, cultural proclivities as synonymous with Islam, there develops a certain inclination to describe things from, let's say, the East in Islamic terms and describe things from the West in non-Islamic terms, to describe, things in the East as anti-colonial and to describe things in the West as colonialist. And that denies the very clear history of cultural appropriation that happened, that denies the history of shall we say, it's the word that I'm looking for, syncretism, and synthesis of cultures. And so, I remember one time being in Mecca, myself and a good friend of mine, we were there for the last 10 nights. We went for Taraweeh. And I had been reading a lot about fashion in the medieval, or in the early Islamic period, about just what kind of clothes did people wear. And there had been some interesting books that had been written where they actually brought the descriptions and then had people draw like artists draw pictures based on those descriptions. And when you start to look at the fashions of the Muslim world and what people would call Muslim clothing, many times, if you would just look a generation before Islam reached that country, you would see the same exact clothing. But because people have been, if you look, for example, if you look at Falahin, you look at like farmers from the Sa'id, right, in Egypt, they wear these hats that are kind of elongated and stuff like that. You can, if you go to the Egyptian National Library, Egyptian National Museum in Tahrir Square, you'll see that same fashion in Egypt for centuries, even before the Islamic period, right? But now it's become synonymous with what Muslims wear because Egyptian is now a majority Muslim country. But at the same time, Christians in Egypt in the rural areas would wear that. You go to Lebanon, certain parts of Syria, people still wear the kafiyah or the shimag or whatever you want to call it. And so when people come and are kind of thrown into the pool of not knowing if they're going to sink or swim in the United States, or wherever they may be, but I'm speaking obviously from my experience in the United States, they start to equate things that were from back home with, as being synonymous with Islam. And that's not bad, but it can be dangerous because it can deny people who are not from that background their own kind of, natural cultural progression within the faith, or under the umbrella of the faith, should I say.
Right. Another analogy that comes up for me, did you ever get into the 90s rock and 90s grunge movement? Were you that cool, or?
I don't think I was that cool, to tell you the truth. If you name some bands, I might know some of them.
But when I was growing up, I mean, I was really into those bands like Nirvana and Soundgarden and Pearl Jam and all this stuff. And I remember this whole grunge brand. It was like wearing, like lumberjack shirts and these types of boots and torn jeans and all this stuff. And it's like, oh, this is grunge, And then it's funny because like I saw a documentary on this whole movement, and the people of Seattle were like, we just found it so ridiculous that like we just happen to be people putting together music, and because this is how a lot of people here dress, because they do a lot of agricultural work and lumberjack work, it's like the corporations came in and just like took all of these symbols of clothing, of this, of that, and made it like a whole brand, so to speak. So
right.
so it's almost like similar where it's anything that has a source is going to have a cultural root to it. And so naturally any religion, I mean, we know this even for, let's say, something like Buddhism. Many people who don't study religion, they assume, oh, Buddhism is like Chinese, but it's like, actually it's from India.
Right.
And it had an Indian flavor, and when it went to China, it immersed itself with the Chinese cultures like Taoism and Confucianism, and then it went to Japan, where they had their own heritage, and it kind of, you keep getting these cultural robes, if you will, as you described. So you're saying, what I'm hearing you say is, there's a difference between the essence of the concepts or the principles, and of course, everything has to come from a source, right? And naturally, there's going to be some cultural paint or gloss, if you will. But that's not always the same thing as Islam itself, because, a Pakistani might think, well, the way I practice Islam is the right way, and somebody who's in America doesn't, who wears jeans and a polo shirt, it's like, oh, I look at you and you're not like Islamic enough, so to speak.
Right, and that's really dangerous. When we look throughout, and there's no doubt that some of that comes as a reaction to kind of post-colonial mindsets in the Muslim world, and people kind of taking pride in whatever they had, and there's nothing wrong with their culture, but the idea that the superiority of their culture is or their culture is prime, while everyone else's is not, is problematic, without obviously toning that according to Islam. I mean, let's take, for example, clothing. There are certain things that were mandated of us to wear loose-fitting clothing, to wear clothing that is modest, that is not ostentatious, so on and so forth. And there's different details of that for both men and for women. But that doesn't say that, for example, we have to wear a certain color or a certain style, or however, Ibn Sa'd in his Tabaqat, this is one of the early works of hadith early works of kind of biographical history. He records in there in the first few volumes, and this volume has actually been translated into English, about the mothers of the believers. And it records them, that Salama, or it's been a long time since I read it, or Aisha, they had a red skirt on with a dark top, so it wasn't this monolithic dress code. And there's also been, from the time of early Islam until the very late period of Islam. So if we say the early Islam, the time of the Prophet ﷺ, where clothes were sent from Abyssinia, and he gave them away to some of his companions. When they wore them, he then said sana, sana, which is the Gi'iz word, the old Ethiopian or old Amharic word for Hasan, for beautiful or pretty.
Mm-hmm.
And so not only was the Prophet ﷺ, having them wear clothes that weren't their own, but he was actually praising those clothes as well. In the late period of when Shirisi, who his death date eludes me right now, but he wrote a book called Al-Mi'yar al-Mu'rib an Fatawa al-Andalus wal-Maghrib. So he's kind of the later Andalusian period where he was collecting the fatwa of scholars from Spain and Morocco, Tunis, those areas. This is kind of, maybe right before, shortly after, during the fall of Al-Andalus. But he's asked in there about wearing a Byzantine style, or he actually records a fatwa, an earlier fatwa, somebody being asked about wearing a Byzantine style robe or a coat that people used to wear in the cold. And, the fatwa, I actually wrote this on, I wrote a short article on it on my website called It's Not What You Wear, It's How You Wear It. Emulation of non-Muslims. So this whole idea of emulating the kuffar, emulating the disbeliever, which in and of itself, there are guidelines for in the religion, but it doesn't have to do with things which are mundane or practical or pragmatic, functional, but more in issues of faith and practice and so on and so forth. So, he basically says, hey, is the coat functional? Does it serve a purpose? Are they the only ones who wear it? If the answer is yes, and to is it being functional, and no to them being the only ones wearing it for a special purpose, then yeah, it's fine to wear, because what's expected to you is to wear what is oh, you believe, take that which is beautiful. Take your clothing, which is beautiful, at every place of prostration. So the believer is supposed to, use what's available to him in the world, and not force himself into one thing or the other. So I guess my point is, if we use that as kind of a case study in how other cultures were accepted, Muslim cultures before the colonial period were always very, and I would say even during the colonial period, were always very accepting of others. And it wasn't until very late when we got these ideas of, and it would need some research to see exactly when it happened. But I would say probably by the 1940s or 50s is when we started getting people using cultural markers as things indicative of Islamic identity.
Right. And it's more politicized too.
Yeah, definitely, because it's a reaction to an overarching culture that was kind of impressing itself and people being impressed by in the Muslim world. So people are wearing suits now, and all this kind of stuff is happening. And so what's Islamic?
Yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, even it plays out within the Muslim collective conscious. Like, I knew a sister from Palestine, and she was sharing with me a story about how, she went to go visit her family on her way to do the pilgrimage, the Hajj. And she went to go hang out with some relatives, and the relatives were like, oh, mashallah, when you come back from Hajj, you're going to become a hijabi. And she was telling me the story, saying what's so funny is, like, my own uncle and aunt, my aunt wears hijab, my uncle has a kufi and a beard and holds his dhikr beads all day, but they don't even pray. And it's like wearing the hijab was more about an Islamic political identity to differentiate oneself from the Israeli community. And, I found that really fascinating, that to such an extent that sometimes we take these quote unquote religious symbols, but they tend to be more of a branch or an extension of our political and cultural identity rather than an existential or spiritual claim.
Right. Yeah, I think that's. I think you're right. That it does kind of play out like that. At times, cultural markers, can be something that people understand or that use as as should I say, pegs for their faith, right?
Sure.
In some, and I know this specifically happens with converts who probably accepted Islam before the age of the internet, and the only thing that was really reaching them were anecdotes and cultural markers and a few basics of the faith. So I have a friend, he told me he met a guy who the only thing he knew about Islam was that Muslims wore a special hat and they read the Quran and they lifted their hands in prayer like more than 3 times a day or more. And that's all. Then this guy did that as his Islam for like 20 years because he lived in some small town where, nobody ever came. And one day a Muslim came to town and he said, okay, now I want you to, I need you to teach me what I'm doing. This is all I know. So every day he would put on his kufi, open his Yusuf Ali translation of the Holy Quran and read it and then make dua morning, noon, and night. And that's all the Islam that he had. But that was the while the idea of wearing the kufi is obviously a cultural marker, right? He was doing it out of some sign of love for Islam and wanting to be devotional. And even though he didn't necessarily understand what that was or what it was about. So I think that, it's apt for us to point out that at times cultural markers and practices do kind of act in a protective sense for some people. I always liken it to like the blanket that Linus carries on the Peanuts cartoon, right? Like a security blanket. It doesn't have a function more than just being a placebo to allow people to feel comfort in what they're doing. And that can be in clothes, that can be in places. Just in California, we were talking about mosques, and there's a Dr. Akhlaq Kahara, who's a professor of architecture and also teaches Islamic studies. He wrote a beautiful article about the function of architecture in promoting faith and identity. And it's readily available on the internet. But he talks about how many mosques are not designed for the promotion of faith, but they're designed to create a feeling of security and a sense of home for people that are far away from their own. And that's where a lot of the tension comes in American Muslim communities, because when I come in with my pants and my jeans and a t-shirt and somebody slaps a topi on my head, right? It's because I've broken the sanctity of that, that warp zone that takes people back to some place where they feel better about themselves. Not that it's necessarily a mandate of faith. I always used to joke because I grew up in Florida, I always used to joke that I was going to go and start a masjid on the beach and mandate that everybody wear like cut off jeans and flip flops.
Subhanallah. So, I mean, I think another way to kind of reduce what we're talking about here is it sounds like there's a difference between the essence of Islam and the form that it takes. And so, for instance, one of the essential principles of Islam is men and women should be modest in their dress and in their behaviors, right? But how that form will take place, of course, there's going to be some variation and flexibility, while at the same time, there are certain things you just can't get away from. And what I mean by that is, okay, so let's say men and women have to dress modestly, whether you're in America, Saudi Arabia, or Gambia, the dress that women will wear doesn't have to be the same exact wardrobe, right? It's not like everyone has to wear black or everyone has to have color and the way they tie their hijab, or not all men have to wear a kameez or whatever, but as long as you're following the essence of the Sharia when it comes to how to cover and how to interact with the opposite gender, those are the basic guidelines. But sometimes that will manifest and change based on the context, right? So like something a little more nuanced, like, you know, showing respect in some Eastern cultures is you look down when you talk to an adult. Whereas in America, if you don't look someone in the eye, that's actually disrespectful and shows, you know, that I don't know if I can trust you, right? Or shaking a woman's hand in Saudi Arabia would be a complete no-no. Whereas in the United States, you know, some people might cringe at the fact that you're not willing to shake a woman's hand. So some men or women might say, well, I shake people's hands. So, you know, how do we know where the line is between, okay, am I going against the essence of the religion, or is this just a matter of how it's manifesting based on the cultural context that I'm in?
Yeah. So, you know, you point to two great things. I think, you know, on the issue of specifically on covering, on like wearing a hat for men. Shaltibi, he mentions, I believe it's in Al-I'tisam. Shaltibi was an Andalusian scholar. Or Andalusi or Spanish origin. He actually mentions, he says, you know, the culture of the scholars of the East, you know, so he's talking about Mashariqa, he's talking about people that are basically anywhere, you know, after Tunis, right? After about midway to through Libya, that's the Islamic East, and they're in the Islamic West. So, you know, he says the Easterners, you know, they don't wear hats as children, and then when they become an alim, they wear a hat or a turban. Where for us Westerners, we only children in Quran schools wear hats. And when a child graduates and you know and finishes their studies, then they take off their hat or their turban. And there's talk. I mean, it needs some research about the whole idea of, you know, the graduation cap being thrown into the air, kind of being connected to this. The idea of baccalaureus coming from the word bihaq al-riwaya in Arabic. I was surprised to actually find that etymologically there is some basis for that. But it just shows you how that was navigated. You talk about, you know, something like shaking hands with the opposite gender, and this is an issue that is discussed classically in books of Islamic law. Probably one of the more thorough discussions of it is by Ibn Muflih in his book Al-Adab al-Shariah, which is a 3-volume book about all of the different etiquettes of Islam. And he says, you know, I can give you the summary. The summary is basically scholars held 3 different opinions about shaking a woman's hand. One of them said that it was unequivocally prohibited, and they based that on certain texts. The fact that the Prophet ﷺ never shook hands, and even when he was taking allegiance from the tribes and women came, he did not shake their hand. He said, "Inni la usafihu nisa," I don't shake hands with women. And then there's a hadith in At-Tabarani, which is extremely different. There's a large amount of difference of opinion about its authenticity, that it's better to be struck in the head with a metal spike than to shake the hand of the opposite gender. Yeah, I personally, you know, from my own research, lean towards the opinion that is not an authentic hadith and therefore doesn't really have any legal weight. But they'll use that hadith. So one group says absolutely not. Another group says that it's allowed if there's some need. If, for example, the custom of the marketplace is to shake hands on a deal, right? And in that case, they should use a glove or a cloth over their hand. It should be said, however, that the proponents of that opinion felt that touching skin to skin of the opposite gender broke your wudu. So it wasn't really the issue of shaking the hand as much as it was breaking the wudu. And then the third group says, well, let's look at the rationale behind this. So there's agreement amongst all scholars, regardless of what opinion they take. If a young woman is or a woman who is young and beautiful and enticing to you, then you're not supposed to shake her hand. And if a woman is old and there's no desire to be had from her, then there's no harm in shaking her hand. These are 2 points of agreement amongst them. And the third, they say, okay, well, what about women who fall in the middle, which they call al-barza in Arabic, which means a woman who goes out, she goes to the marketplace, she does business, she's modest in herself, she's upholding the professional standards and the personal standards of a Muslim woman, but she's not, and obviously we're talking about, medieval archetypes of women, right? I think this is important to state, right? We're talking about medieval archetypes of women that are mentioned in these books. We're not stating how people are today, in all senses. So, you have the virgin who's at home and she covers her face with the veil and she's extremely shy. You have the elderly woman, which, is beyond the age of marriage and, no one would be attracted to her. And then you have the person who kind of falls in the middle. The middle-aged professional woman who goes out and does business, is modest, but still has no problem approaching people and making a deal, getting things done. So they held that while it was not permissible to shake the hand of the young, beautiful woman due to the fitna and the enticement that can occur, and it was permissible to shake the hand of the old woman because of the lack of any enticement, in the shaking the hand of the woman who's in a professional situation, if there was some need to, while it may be disliked, it is allowed. And so this group is saying we have to look at the rationale behind the action and not just the action itself, because we don't have any unequivocal statement from the Prophet ﷺ that is unequivocally authentic and unequivocally express in the prohibition of shaking hands between men and women. And therefore, it goes back to this idea of fitna and the enticement that happens by the interaction of the sexes, just as believers are ordered to lower their gaze at times, right? They're also allowed to look at times, just as he also mentions in there a few tangential issues, like, for example, if a woman covers her face, then it is permissible for her to show her face to people who need to ascertain her identity for either business or security reasons. And it is permissible for somebody to ask for that to be done. So, I'm mentioning this issue because it kind of frames for us. It frames for us what, where does this idea of deen start, and where does it end? Where does culture start? Where does it end? And I think that in some areas we are simply held to standards of conduct, and those are not they're not dogmatic, bright line rules that we are forced or expected to do at all times. Imam Ahmed was asked, a man and a woman are standing talking in the street. Is this khalwa? Is this seclusion? He said, well, if they're in the middle of the street, then it's not seclusion, right? Because the Prophet ﷺ said that when a man and a woman are alone in a room, then the third of them is shaitan, right? So we obviously then understand that we should not be secluded with the opposite sex because of the dangers of enticement. But if somebody's in a public place, like a place of work, where there's the expectation of monitoring and transparency and so on and so forth, then it's different. And people have to, and this is what I advocate for, people have to understand that, number one, you need to gain enough understanding of the faith and kind of the moral framework that's laid out by it to confidently live in your own skin as a Muslim. I think that a lot of a lot of the conflict that happens in the minds of Muslims themselves is that they are strict adherents to something I call Sunday school Islam.
Right.
And they haven't, they're 40 years old and they haven't learned anything past their Sunday school, what they've learned in Sunday school. And that's fine if all you want to do is just say, hey, I'm just going to pray and fast and do my basics, and I'm not going to really worry about anything else. But if you are worried about how your faith speaks to certain issues, then it really takes developing a level of religious literacy that you can't simply get from Sunday school. And that means applying yourself just as one would apply themselves in learning the latest about politics, about social issues, about technology, whatever it is. Then people should be willing to do the same for their faith if it is part and parcel of their identity. But I think that all of this draws us into a necessary distinction in the conversation about identity. And that is that Islam as a faith is primarily concerned about our actions, our faith and our actions, not our identity.
Mm.
And what I mean by that is that my culture and identity can change throughout my life. So, if I remember one scholar that I met who was born in Syria, but later left Syria and moved to another Arab country where he was given citizenship. And when people would ask him, what are you? And he would say, I'm Moroccan. And they would say, but no, you're from Aleppo or Damascus or wherever he was from. And he would say, okay, fine, but I'm a Moroccan. I'm a Moroccan. And it didn't click for a lot of people because nationality was still synonymous with place of birth, which was still synonymous with faith, right? Mm-hmm. So our identities can change throughout our lives, but our faith remains the same. It remains kind of the anchoring that we use to keep ourselves on the straight and narrow. But those things may change from time and from place. Obviously, there's going to be certain things in the faith that are no-goes, and there's going to be certain things that are flexible because there are no bright line rules. There's not unequivocal prohibitions or mandates to do those certain things. But how are we going to know that? Only by gaining a level of religious literacy that allows us to do so. And that's probably my biggest gripe with a lot of people that talk on, and a lot of them who even call themselves Muslim leaders here in the United States, and they're featured at conferences and things like that. They might be famous, they might have been on television or have done great things in their personal areas, but they're not necessarily speaking to Islam as a faith. They're speaking to Islam as a culture, one that is an American culture informed by another culture, not an American culture informed by Islamic, faith-based morals and precepts.
Right. So just to kind of bring it into a context of American Islam, like some people have a problem with that, right? Like, oh, I'm an American Muslim. And I don't have a problem saying that. I mean, but I do get your point, which is very important, that people's individual cultures and attitudes and values certainly can evolve, especially if you live in different cultures and countries and societies. But at some point, you will probably hit a wall where to adapt or assimilate to that particular culture could mean changing the narrative or certain rules or principles about the religion itself, right? So, for example, premarital sex. Unfortunately, it's becoming more common amongst American Muslims. And instead of looking at it as, well, this American facet of how to be in relationship or what's, common before marriage that I may embark on, I could sit here and say, well, I'm more American And so that's why I embark in these things, even though Islamically I know it's wrong. And there's people that acknowledge that and they know they're sinning because they still believe this is haram according to Islamic law. But then you have, of course, now situations where people are like, well, hold on a second. Since a lot of things are interpreted in Islam anyways, let's go back to these primary sources and try to almost change the narrative or come up with new interpretations, sometimes that have never been formulated before in 1400 years of scholasticism. And now all of a sudden it's like, okay, this is a new way to understand these actual first principles of the Quran and Sunnah. I mean, there is a point where you are now just changing the religion and innovating, if you will. You're not actually reinterpreting it, because you're now, the form of what you're doing is taking away from the essence of that first principle, like having modesty, protection of family and lineage, and not breaking people's hearts. And a lot of that comes with, having sexual relations without any regulation, so to speak.
Yeah, contravening clear-cut texts of the Quran and the Sunnah under the guise of reinterpretation. I would say, people are having premarital sex all over the world, even the Muslim,
even in Muslim countries. Yeah, absolutely.
People are having premarital sex. They're watching porn. They're involved in homosexuality and lesbianism. They're drinking alcohol. They're using, intoxicants, narcotics, that type of thing. And I think that the legitimization of those things by people in the United States under the guise of being American is just really weak. And the reason being is because as someone born and raised in the predominant, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant culture of the United States, can tell you that there are many people who do not involve themselves in premarital sex. They do not partake in drugs or alcohol. And they do so out of a feeling of honor and a feeling of personal protection and a feeling of morality, whether that's informed by faith or not. And so when I find Muslims who are saying, well, we're just adapting to the predominant culture. I mean, but are you really? I have a good friend of mine who's a local education director at an Islamic center, and was an imam for some time before that. And he's Latino. And, it's funny. He was like, I don't know why all these Muslims are tripping out about Thanksgiving. We never did Thanksgiving when we were growing up. It's not our thing. Right. So we sometimes project our own desires onto the popular culture to legitimize our own actions so that we don't have to deal with the moral conundrum of, am I doing right or wrong in Islam? So we become kind of relativistic in that sense of, oh, there's no problem with any of it because, I'm just practicing my local culture, and this is my local culture. Whereas on the other extreme of that, and some people may do that, and if somebody does that out of just not knowing, out of weakness, out of just wanting to fit in, those are personal issues that they have to work through. The problem becomes when, as you mentioned, rightly so, that there's a reinterpretation or an attempt at reinterpretation of texts that make the halal haram and the haram halal. In the hadith of Adi ibn Hatim, radiallahu anhu, who was a Christian who accepted Islam, was from the north of Arabia, the area of Tay, Jabal Tay, the two mountains of Tay. And the Prophet ﷺ recited to him the verse, اتخذوا رهبانهم اتخذوا
they took their rabbis and monks as lords, I believe.
Yes, اتخذوا أحبارهم ورهبانهم. So the verse says, اتخذوا أحبارهم ورهبانهم أربابا من دون الله. They took their monks and their priests as lords other than God. And Adi said, ما كنا نعبدهم يا رسول الله. We didn't worship them. ما كنا نسجد لهم. We didn't make prostration to them. And he said, when they would make the halal haram, and they would make the haram halal, would you follow them in that? And he said, yes. He said, tilka ibadatuhum. That was your worship.
Right.
So there is something to be said about going against what are unequivocal, obligations and or prohibitions in Islam. Now, they may be few, right? They may be fewer than what people think. I mean, I think some people think like everything is haram, right? But in reality, it's only a handful of things. And the obligations, likewise, are very few. The problem is when people will try to, in essence, extract from, this Muslim legal scholars have talked about this. They say this principle, as hermeneutic principle, لا يجوز الاستنباط من النص بما يعود عليه بالبطلان. It is not permissible to extrapolate from a text something that would invalidate that text itself.
Interesting. So you can't be a meat-eating vegan if you're reading the manual on veganism.
Exactly.
There's no way you can interpret that and be like, well, this is symbolic for animals, and so the flesh is really just a symbol here. It's not the actual thing, so I'm going to eat meat, but I'm still going to, preach that I'm a vegan, so to speak.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like people say, how are you a vegan? You're eating that steak. Didn't the cow eat grass? I mean, I'm just eating it in its processed form.
Exactly. Yeah.
Have a few friends who are devout vegans, and they find it good for themselves. But the difference between that, and saying that, meat is haram is a huge difference. There's a difference between saying that I believe that processed food, processed meat and what's the word that's used? Farm manufactured, there's a specific word that's...
You mean like the non-free range?
Yeah, mass produced meat factories. There's no doubt that there's many, many unethical things that happen in those and the abuse of animals and their mistreatment. And if a person said, you know what, I'm not even going to support that by eating meat, then, they can't be blamed for that. Ibn Abdul Barr, he says that if a person were to abstain from something out of protecting their personal piety, then no one can blame them for that. The difference is when you start taking your personal piety and propping it up to the level of this is what God wants from you, then that's when you're innovating, you're engaging in a bid'ah. And in fact, I believe it was a Shatibi again himself that said that. Dr. Sherman Jackson has a great article where he comments on a Shatibi's work. I forget the name of it, but I'll send you a link to the PDF. It's a small book that he wrote, or a paper that he wrote several years ago. That kind of spells out, this difference in the English language. It's one of the better things about the subject written in the English language.
Great.
And so there's a difference between saying, I don't do this because of X, or I do this because of Y, and then saying, no, this is what God wants from me, or say God does not want that from me. Those are two wholly different things, and it's important that we make a difference between those things, lest we fall into the very real danger of attributing to God that which we don't know, which is, again, expressly prohibited in the Quran.
Right.
Don't claim that which you have no knowledge of.
Right, which is why it's so essential to go back to, you mentioned two important points, which I want to summarize here. So number one is Islamic literacy is of the essence, right? فَعْلَمْ أَنَّهُ لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا اللَّهِ, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands. So we as Muslim, if you're a serious Muslim, right, then seeking knowledge until the day you die and recognizing you're never going to stop learning is of the essence. And so naturally, and this is something I've worked with a lot of Muslims, and this is a very common pattern, Brother Joe, is, I'm sometimes shocked by the lack of Islamic literacy, or like you said, they haven't graduated past Sunday school, right? And then it's like they wonder why there's all these issues or concerns or misunderstandings or disdain towards certain things in the religion, because they don't this concept of udkhulu fi silmi kafa isn't really there yet. Like, come into the deen fully, which means you got to understand it holistically. So that's a very important point that you highlighted here. The second one is, I love this example of the hadith you mentioned of this Christian Sahabi who became Muslim, and how the Prophet ﷺ clarified that, what we learned from this is that the word ibadah in Islamic theology is a pretty full and broad term. It's not just about prostrating yourself to somebody, but the word ibadah, at least from my understanding, includes not only servitude and service to the one your master or the one you love, but it also means adoration and obedience and dependence, right? And trying to do things which please the one that you worship. Similarly, if I told you, I worship Michael Jordan, I'm not probably worshiping some statue of Michael Jordan in my house, right? I mean, right. You wouldn't be talking to me if that was the case. But I mean, what does it mean when I say that? It's like, oh, you must love Michael Jordan. He's your favorite player. You've got his sneakers, his t-shirts, his autograph. You love watching his clips, so there's this devotional love and adoration and wanting to know and to cling and to bind to this object of worship. And that's my understanding of how we're supposed to worship God. So naturally, if I know that God has clearly stated something isn't correct, it doesn't matter how I rationalize it or how I reinterpret it or water it down, I'm no longer really worshiping God. Right? I'm worshiping some intellectual construct or some leader or some speaker or some writer, because now what they had to say appeals to my own ego or my agenda more, and now I'm going to follow that. So that's actually a way where we commit a type of psychological idolatry, which brings me to this third point that I wanted to unpack with you a bit more before we end today, is this idea of idolatry of Islam itself. So commonly people say to me, what does Islam say? Am I going against Islam? And usually I ask them, well, let's call Islam up and ask them. It's almost like this over-personification of Islam. And as you know, there are many quote-unquote, Islams out there with a lowercase I. And so that's one of the things I wanted to kind of explore a bit more with you today is, clearly there's a difference between what is Islamic constructs versus what Allah and His Messenger have made clear or brought to us. And is it correct to say that what we would call the Islamic tradition today is basically 1400 years of scholarship and effort of men and women to extract the essential principles and teachings and give them practical form based on the socio-political and cultural environments that they were in? Because as even today, when we asked you some of these questions, mashallah, you did a great job at referring to, texts and scholars who have commented about these subjects. And so usually we go back and we're like, okay, what did other people say about this that we trust and that have the scholarship and the background to answer these questions, and then we basically sometimes merge this or make it synonymous with, well, this is what Islam says, but maybe it's just what Imam Ash-Shayuti or Imam Joe Bradford said, right? So there is, of course, a difference here between...
Thank God I'm not an imam.
Well, there is a difference, right? And so is it correct to even say, like, with the Islamic tradition today is a human construct based on a divine reality or principle, or how would you frame that in a healthy way?
I mean, that has to be picked apart about a bit, and I think it's ripe for a whole other conversation, to tell you the truth. But I do believe that much of what we call, so not Islam, right, per se, as the overarching umbrella of faith, but much of what is considered Islamic is a cultural, or it's a construct that grows out of people using faith to inform certain ideas. Mm-hmm. And I'd say probably the earliest instance of this differentiation, probably Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari, the great theologian and scholar of the past, who wrote a book called Maqalat al-Islamiyyin, the statements, or the what's the word? The statements of the Islamists, mm-hmm. the Islamics, basically. And in this book, he's talking about all different types of sects and subsects and ideological movements and political movements and people that are some way tangentially associated with Islam and Muslims, but are not necessarily speaking about Islam as, authoritatively or in a primary sense. And I think making those differentiations is important, but also not allowing this differentiation to allow us that in the name of our own cultural construct of American Islam to then deny the unequivocal and or predominant concepts of Islam to take place and take root in our lives in the United States. And I believe it was Abul Hassan al-Nadwi who first warned of this. A few of his lectures are translated online, and these were lectures that he delivered, I believe, when he went to the UK. And and he warned of people, amalgamating or assimilating to the point where, Islam as a overarching faith concept that informs all areas of life is lost to a cultural concept, which then takes faith out of the picture. Mm-hmm. And I always tell people say, oh, isn't this extreme or yada yada yada. I mean, when we talk about concepts in Islamic theology like jama'ah, the congregation, al-ummah, the community, the nation. When we talk about Islam as this broad set of principles that we follow, and I would just remind them that go and look at the last election, and you will find that Christians of all stripes, whether they be evangelicals or Catholics or whoever, will all say, well, the kingdom of God comes before the kingdom of man. Mm-hmm. And what they mean by that is that their concept of faith and community informed by faith and their obligations of faith come before the obligations that they have to their fellow man. Their obligations to their fellow man are informed by their faith and based upon the benefit and harm that results from there. So, I'm here in Texas when the whole refugee refugee problems were flaring up, and they were saying they weren't going to accept refugees, and the governor tried to put a hold on refugees coming into the state. A lot of people don't know this, but it was Christians that stepped in and told the governor, "Are you telling us we can't do the work of Christ in Texas? Because if you are, we have a very large electoral block in the state. So just let us know if we can't practice the will of Christ." And then he suddenly, he didn't have a change of heart, but there was some political maneuvering, and then magically refugees come to Texas again. So, I think we have to be very careful with saying that issues of Islam, or shall say, Islamic culture, are merely informed by culture. And that's true in some sense. And they are, as you said, constructs that were kind of created over time. At times they are constructs which are extrapolated. They're derived from texts. They're not informed by any one specific text. And they still hold the weight of having, of being, shall I say, of being upheld and honored and revered by Muslims. Just because they don't have one specific verse, one specific hadith, but because they are derived from a corpus of indications from hadith, like there are several broader principles of Islam that this applies to. Al-mashaqqatu tajlibu at-taysir. Hardship induces ease. This is a principle of the faith, which is never it's never vocalized in one specific place. But we have so many different instances that through induction we can tell that this is a principle of the faith. Right? And that it applies in so many different areas. Um, and so I guess my point being is that we have three things. We have things which Muslims do that are informed or have kind of taken on an Islamic nature because of their connection to Muslims and their and Muslim gatherings and practices. Kind of like the overuse of mashallah and alhamdulillah and subhanallah for everything, right?
Right.
Yes, those are adhkar that are found in the primary texts, but using them in those specific instances are not, there's nothing to mandate them, right? But there's also nothing to say that they're bad. I mean, it's like people congratulating each other on Eid, right? There's nothing from the Prophet that says congratulate each other on Eid. There's no Eid congratulations from the Prophet. The Sahaba used to just say, may Allah accept from us and from you, right? But if somebody comes and says Eid Mubarak, is this wrong? No, because it feeds into the larger strain of culture which supports the practice of faith, and does not contravene it or denigrate it. Right. And that's different. That's different than the practice of culture that contravenes faith and denigrates it. Like we find, unfortunately, in some Muslim lands, they'll have tribal councils and tribunals that are set up by tribes in their area, which then come and they will make the most heinous of judgments against people in these areas, and people say, oh, look what the Muslims are doing and look what Islam does. No, that's just Muslims giving their tribes and their cultural norms primacy. Things like, this guy married the wrong person, go and throw acid on the girl or something, disgusting like that. This happens at times from tribal councils that are not ruling by Islam. They're not informed by Islamic morality or law, but they are Muslims and they're looked at as being in the Muslim land. So then that becomes synonymous with being Muslim, what Muslims do. Right. So I'm saying that as a very extreme example to show, how badly culture can inform something which is then looked at as being Islamic in popular culture. And then you have the Eid example, right? Which it doesn't contravene, it doesn't denigrate, therefore it's allowed. Al-Hafidh ibn Hajar wrote a whole book small treatise about this. And then you have things which are not informed by any one particular hadith or ayah or nas, right? Text of Islam, but they are informed by a corpus of the texts and they're kind of understood from that. Then those are to be upheld as well. And that's what we call ghalabat al-dhann, a predominant assumption that this is what is wanted from us. And then you have things which are qat'i, they're unequivocal. Those are the things that we find that are the big issues of Islam, right? Worshipping God alone, not worshiping anyone else. Obedience to the Prophet, praying your 5 prayers, fasting Ramadan, not committing murder. Things that are, they're the big issues that no one can really deny. And the danger is that now we have people that are saying, hey guys, let's uphold, these tribal issues that are synonymous with what Muslims do and not uphold these big unequivocal issues that are attacking those larger unequivocal issues as something that is merely interpretive. So it's really a really kind of contradiction in terms when you see that coming from the same people. Right.
Yeah, I mean, I'm almost hearing you say like, okay, there's things that are, so what is Islamic? There's obviously things that are Islamic based on the clear stipulations or principles from the Quran and Sunnah. Then there's things that are Islamic that could be reflections in a culture that don't contradict the Quran and Sunnah. So for instance, going and feeding the hungry at your local church as a Muslim, there's nothing religiously wrong with doing that, right? Even though there might be some Muslims who are like, oh, astaghfirullah, you're going to a church. It's like, dude, I'm fulfilling a principle that all the prophets taught, right? Jesus, Muhammad, Musa, peace be upon them all. So that's not an issue. Or moms against drunk driving, right? Or whatever, right?
I'll give you another example. Just Just this past Saturday, I was in Southern California for the first annual Converts Conference. And it was a conference that was organized by converts and people that work with new Muslims, and targeted at them and all of the topics that were there. And obviously the question comes up, what about going to our non-Muslim families' funerals? So, you ask the average, mutawwa, mulvi, muddayin, whatever you want to call them in various different Muslim cultures, and they may tell you, oh no, you shouldn't do that. You shouldn't do that. But when we look to Abdullah ibn Abbas, the companion of the Prophet ﷺ, one of his students who had relatives who were not Muslim, one of those non-Muslim relatives died. He came to class sad. So what are you sad for? He said, well, my relative died. He said, well, what are you doing here? What harm would it have done you to go and stand with the body and follow it until it had been placed in its grave? So, to attend a family member or a friend or whoever's funeral, as long as you're not engaging in, scholars commenting on Ibn Abbas' statement said, as long as you're not engaging in issues of shirk, of ascribing partners and worshiping partners, other people other than Allah, then it's the honorable thing to do. A funeral procession passed by the Prophet ﷺ, and he stood up. And somebody said, and the hadith is in Bukhari, Muslim, as well as in An-Nasa'i. And the Prophet ﷺ, they said, "What? This is a Jewish person's funeral." And he said, "Alaysat nafsan? Is it not a soul?" So, that kind of tells us, this, false sense of identity through pietistic antagonism is many times at odds with the principles of faith itself.
Right. In other words, anything that's going to take away from your humanism, right, is probably not a good sign.
Probably, yeah.
That's I think obviously can be explored based on case by case, but that's something that I've kind of taken away from some of your reflections. Now, Imam Joe, it's been a wonderful discussion so far. I want to get you back on for part 2 to talk more about American Islam and these ideas about culture. Thank you so much for your thoughts and reflections, and looking forward to recording part 2 with you soon.
Great, sounds good. I'm looking forward to that. Thank you so much for having me on.
Akramakum Allah, akhi. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa barakatuh.
Karim Sirajuddin here. Thank you for tuning in. Please visit nurhuman.com to learn more about how I provide personal, spiritual, and relationship counsel. Please generously help sponsor this show to keep on going at patreon.com/coffeewithkareem. That's patreon.com/coffeewithkareem.